All right, well, let me get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for the MedDRA API webinar. This webinar kicks off what we're calling the evaluation period for the application program interfaces that the MSSO has developed. And part of the reason we're having this webinar is to start the process of soliciting feedback for these APIs. As Liz mentioned, if you need to ask a question, you can use the chat function of the webinar tool to answer, to ask a question, and we will be taking questions at the end of this presentation. So just a quick agenda here. We're going to talk a little bit about the reason the MSSO has developed a set of application program interfaces, some assumptions for this webinar. I'll then go into the scope of what the APIs cover. I'll also talk about a tool called Swagger, which some of you that have developed APIs may be very familiar with, and how that can be very useful to understand how the APIs work. And then we'll go into a set of application program interface frequently asked questions that the MSSO has anticipated. And then we'll open things up for Q&A. So what is the reason the MSSO has developed a set of APIs? Well, principally we did that because we are responding to users' requests to provide that type of technology. And those of you that are familiar with APIs know that they are what's called an open software model versus a closed model of just providing a tool with an interface, and you have very limited things that you can do within that tool. The APIs allow for a lot more flexibility, and they allow users to develop their own MedDRA tools or add on to existing tools, which provides a way to accurately depict MedDRA without having to know about the details of the MedDRA data structure. And it also fills a gap in our current tool offering. And so providing the APIs gives a useful way for users to leverage them to do functions like browsing and searching and things like that. And of course, the APIs include all of the MedDRA versions and translations that are presently available in MedDRA. And of course, as time moves forward and if we add new languages, then those would be included as well. So a few assumptions about this webinar. The first is that you have some knowledge of MedDRA structure and term attributes. So that includes the 5-level hierarchy, the attributes like currency, multi-axiality, primary, secondary SOC, information about SMQs, etc. Now, the information that Liz referred to earlier that we provided in a package is really meant for those with an IT and software development background. So you need to have that in order to fully understand the scope of what is being provided. Now, having said that, this webinar is just going to provide high-level explanations of the APIs, general information to understand, what the APIs are all about. If there are complex topics that are brought up in the Q&A, we will either handle those through our help desk or possibly through separate discussions, as we just won't have the capability of handling them in this format here. So if you registered for this webinar, you should have received a link to some information that provides detailed descriptions of the APIs. The first is a application programmer's user's guide or programmer's user's guide that provides all of the details of the API functions, the various parameters, request and response models, etc. We also provided a set of input examples. These are JSON formatted input examples to use. We also included the list of anticipated frequently asked questions, a number of which we'll be going over today in this webinar, and also a feedback worksheet to provide us some, I guess, answers to questions that we have, and a way for you to provide some information back to us during this evaluation period. Now, if you did not receive this information, I think the first thing for those that are attending the webinar, I'll ask Liz to do if she can use the chat function to send the link out to everybody in case they did not receive it. And for those that may be viewing this webinar, the recorded version of this webinar, they can send an email to the MSSO help desk at mssohelp@meddra.org and request that information, and it'll be sent right out to you. The help desk is aware that you may be asking, and they have a link that they can readily send you. The one thing that I will mention about the documentation is that as we're in this evaluation period, it is not final documentation. So we expect that this documentation will change a little bit over time, and that likely is going to be based on feedback provided by everyone here on this webinar and others that are interested. So just something to keep in mind. So what is the scope of the APIs that have been developed? Well, for those of you that are familiar with the MSSO's tools, principally the web-based browser and the MedDRA version analysis tool, the APIs cover virtually all of the features and functions of those tools. So that includes things such as performing searches in MedDRA, the ability to browse the MedDRA and SMQ hierarchy. In other words, get the parents and children of requested terms, term detail information. That includes the codes associated with the terms, the primary and secondary SOC information, etc. Information about SMQs, in other words, the PTs that are in SMQs, as well as information about an SMQ itself, including the description, the source, the notes, etc. There's also a history function, which I don't think I listed here. That's available. There are APIs that will explain or provide what languages and versions of MedDRA are available. Additionally, there's also, for those of you that have used our self-service application, there's an API that will help you validate the subscription status of your business partners. So everyone knows that as part of your MedDRA subscription, if you're going to exchange MedDRA coded data with your business partners, both partners need to have a subscription. This is a way to validate that that business partner has a valid MedDRA license. Additionally, we've included the more recent features and functions of the web-based browser, for those of you that are aware of that. The first is the SMQ analysis function, and that is a way to upload a set of MedDRA terms and identify which SMQs those terms are in. In other words, essentially SMQ analysis. There's also a hierarchy analysis function, which allows users to input a set of terms and get the primary and secondary hierarchy of those terms. And we've also included the functions of the MedDRA version analysis tool, MVAT. So you have the ability to produce a version report between any two MedDRA releases, and that version report contains information about the changes that have occurred. New terms, for example, changes to existing terms, that's demotions of PTs to LLTs, promotions of LLTs to PTs, the movement of LLTs, SMQ information, etc. And also the data impact report, which is where you provide information to the API, and it will tell you what changes have occurred between two MedDRA releases that you specify. So if you've used any of these tools, you should be very familiar with these features and functions. The APIs do all of that. Now, in addition to the documentation that we provided, we also have included a link to a open source tool, a plugin essentially, called Swagger. And for those of you that have developed APIs as part of your job, or at least familiar with API development, you've probably heard of this tool or even used it or some tool similar to it. The whole point of Swagger is that it provides a way to understand how the APIs work without having to develop code on how to call the APIs. And it's meant to be used with the detailed documentation that we've provided, the input examples, and Swagger itself includes some abbreviated explanation of the API parameters. So what I'd like to do is a very short demonstration of Swagger so that you can understand how to use this tool. So I'm just going to come right out of the presentation here for just a second. And I've clicked, the link here. This is in our detailed documentation, this particular link that you see here. And it'll take you to the list of MedDRA APIs. And the first thing that you want to do is to authorize yourself so that you can use Swagger and execute the APIs through this interface. To do that, you click the Authorize button, and you just check this little box here to gain access and click Authorize. And then you will be requested to put in your MedDRA ID and password, just like you do for a web-based browser or an MVAT. I'm going to put in a one that we use for some demonstrations here. Okay, so once you've authenticated, you just click Close, and you'll notice this little lock here has closed, so you're now authorized, and you can now use the Swagger tool to understand the APIs on top of the documentation that's been provided. Now, the first thing you'll notice is the APIs are listed here by name, and you can probably tell what some of these do just by the names. You'll also notice that there's a different color code here. The blue color represents APIs that are called through the URL that use either no or very few parameters. The green represents APIs that require JSON formatted input, in other words, a request model in order to use. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So I'll demonstrate here the release API. This is just a single URL call with no parameters, and it just provides information about the various releases that are available. And to use that, you just click the tryout button and then click execute, again, as there's no parameters. And then below, you'll get the response body for this API. Let me just scroll down here just a bit. So you can see, if you look carefully, it will start to provide you information about the MedDRA releases that are available, in this case, Chinese 12.1, and so on. Now, you can download this information by clicking the download button. And it will open up a file that you can either save, or in this case, I'm just going to open it up right here, that provides the full response body, response output. So this is exactly what you saw in the earlier screen here about the versions that are available, and you can see the various formats here. Okay. All right, now I'm going to close this one up, and I'll do two others that require more input. The first we'll take a look at is the search API. And you'll notice here that the request model is requiring a number of different pieces of input. Now, I won't be able to go into the details of all of this input. What I want to show is how you can use the examples that we provided as input into Swagger to help you understand the APIs. So the first thing you want to do is click Try Out, and you'll notice that this input model or request model becomes editable. You can directly edit this if you'd like, or you can use the input examples that we provided with the documentation, which is what I'm going to do here. These are a set of JSON formatted request models for the APIs that require them. And we've got a number of different examples here. I'm going to select this one here called the search example. This is searching in the system organ class, in other words, the terms under the SOCs. In this case, I am searching in the English language. I'm also adding French and Hungarian to the output for version 22.1, and the term that I'm searching for is liver failure. So what I can do is I can just take this and copy it, and then I can actually just paste over the information that's in the request model here. So you see I've got the same information that I just showed you. The search for liver failure in English and for MedDRA 22.1 with French and Hungarian as additional languages. So I want to execute that. And then below you see the response body for the search results. Let me just scroll down just a little bit so everyone can see that. Okay, so you can see here liver failure and the French and the Hungarian. So I'm gonna download that so everyone can see it a little bit clearer and open this up. Okay. Right. So this is the response body for the search API. And again, if you're familiar with our web-based browser or the MedDRA desktop browser, the information is organized in a similar way. We have these search categories that we fill in with the search results. We have what's called an exact match, which you see here, and then the term name, and because I've chosen additional languages, they're listed here. In this case, it's an LLT. It is a current term, and then you'll see other categories like lexical variant, failure liver, and we also have a feature in the web-based browser for synonym groupings of high-level synonyms. In this case, the liver hepatic synonym group. So a search for liver will pull up hepatic terms, and you can see right here acute hepatic failure is one of those in the synonym category. So this produces the exact output that you would have in our web-based browser. Right. I'll just do one other example here. I'm going to close up the search API, and I'm going to go to what's called the type API. The principal function of the type API is to provide the parents and children of requested terms. And again, you can see the request model for that API. And if you want to try it out, you just click the try out button, and then you have the an editable field here that you can change the parameters and execute. In this case, I want to go and use the examples that we provided. And in this case, I want to search for the children of the PT headache. So let me just pull that up so I can show you what that looks like. Again, we're in the SOC view, and we have the code for PT headache in this case, and the level of that term. Actually, I'm sorry, this is the parent. Let me go to another example here. Here we go, children. All right. So similar information, the SOC view, the code, the level, and then the R type here, in this case, the C means children, the language, and the version of MedDRA that you're interested in. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to just replace that and then execute. And as I mentioned, you can change this information here as you want to do different examples. So you can put another, different code and different language, different version, things like that. And you'll notice in the response body down here, these are all the children of PT headache. So these are all the LLTs. And I'll just download that so everyone can see that. So again, this is the response body for that API, the type API for children. So you'll notice these are all the LLTs. So the LLT code, and this is the PT code that we requested, and the LLT name, the currency, etc. Now there's other parameters in here that are used for different scenarios. These three here are used related to SMQs if you were to request the children of an SMQ, for example. So all of this information is not necessarily filled out. It just depends on what you're requesting. Okay. The other thing I'll point out about Swagger is that it does contain higher level information about the parameters. If you click model here, it provides you the information about the various parameters and when they would be used. The details of this information are in that programmer's guide that I referred to. But this is a handy reference, but definitely don't ignore the programmer's guide because the details are in there. The other thing I'll point out is at the very bottom of the interface are these request and response models. And unfortunately, Swagger doesn't do a very good job in organizing these, so it's difficult to tell which request model goes with which response model, etc. So to assist users with that, we have provided a table in the appendix of the programmer's guide that lists for each API what the request and response models are. So that should be a helpful guide to you. All right, I'm going to switch now back to the presentation. And what I'd like to go through now is some of the frequently asked questions that we anticipate. And then we will talk about, or open things up rather for Q&A, and we'll take as many questions as we can. So the first thing I'd like to inform everybody about is the evaluation schedule. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the evaluation phase, and we first started to send out information, the documentation that I've been referring to about a week ago. And today, of course, we're having the webinars, one today, one tomorrow. And after that, we are in what we're calling the evaluation period. What we'd like to do is begin to ask for feedback on the APIs roughly about a month and a half from now, beginning of April, just to see, what users think and collect information about the APIs that they've evaluated. And then after that, on a to be determined schedule, we will then begin to engage users through either additional webinars or other formats to help us finalize the APIs. And that period will last up until about August, and then we will move into the deployment phase, and we anticipate deploying in October of 2020. Right, so that's the schedule that we're currently operating on. Now, is it possible in your feedback to suggest additional API functions? The answer to that is yes. However, the MSSO cannot guarantee that we would adopt any requested functions, or for functions that we would agree to develop, there's no guarantee that we'd be able to provide those by the October 2020 deadline. Our goal is to get a standard set of APIs out first before we do any additional work. Now, having said that, we do plan for future API functions. The one that we'd be focused on is a API related to the mapping of SNOMED CT and MedDRA. Now, for those of you that are keeping up with current events related to MedDRA. We have been involved with external parties in developing a mapping between SNOMED CT, which is a terminology used to capture mostly electronic health records, and MedDRA. There's a number of reasons why that's desirable. The ultimate reason really is for improved health outcomes. Once that mapping becomes final, which is expected towards the end of this year, we will then begin to develop an API focused on that mapping. And then as future mappings are developed, we would also provide APIs for those. So we do have or will have an API versioning strategy. The way that's going to work is that the versioning will be included in the header of the API call. And what this means is that if we're going to be changing the inputs and outputs, then we will create a new version of that API so that users can continue to use the old one, and then they can graduate to the new one as they see fit. Now, this versioning strategy is not in place yet. It is not in the documentation that we provided, but as soon as we have that in place, we'll be updating the documentation and providing that information as soon as possible. The API architecture will be cloud-based, and we will be providing that in multiple locations to ensure availability, fault tolerance, and extensibility. Now, the one thing I do need to mention at this time is that the APIs are still in a test environment. We do hope to move them to our production environment in the next month or so. But I mention that just because the test environment could go up or down as we are transitioning to the production environment. So again, just something to keep in mind in the next month or so as we transition. So the security controls that we will be putting in place are going to be commensurate with the type of information provided by the APIs. So that's MedDRA terms, codes, and associated information. The controls will include, but are not limited to, things such as vulnerability scanning, continuous monitoring, log monitoring, access control, etc. Now, as you can imagine, the API calls will require encryption. I'm sure that's for many of you a no-brainer, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of that. And then, of course, users with valid subscriptions will have access to the APIs. So in other words, if you don't have a MedDRA subscription, you will not be able to take advantage of the APIs, just like of the other MedDRA resources we provide. Now, I mentioned logging in the previous slide. We will be capturing logs from the APIs, but they will be focused on technical issues, utilization, and performance. We will not be capturing term input, just like in our other tools and that in the web-based browser. We don't capture any of that information either. We do capture logs to help us with these other areas that I've mentioned, but that's what the logging is limited to. Throttling technology will be used once in the production environment to ensure fair and even access. That configuration is yet to be determined, but we will be adjusting that throttling as needed based on the usage. When the APIs are put into production, we will have an end user license agreement in place, which is going to provide availability goals for the APIs. We are at a minimum focused on 99.9% availability. Users will be required to accept the license agreement before using the APIs, and the MSSO will not be entering into formal service level agreements with organizations. We are developing a test document that's under development to make it presentable to an external audience about how the APIs were tested. Essentially, the tests include the inputs and outputs that were used compared against our existing tools, which do not yet use the APIs. So this is how we can ensure that the information we're providing matches our existing tool sets. And when that document is available, we'll provide it to users. So if you have, outside of the Q&A session that we're about to go into, other questions that may pop up as you review the information, you are more than welcome to send a question to our help desk at mssohelp@meddra.org. Please do include the subject of API question so that it is clear what your question is about, and that will be routed to our IT team, who will then respond as quickly as possible. Now, additionally, the MSSO will be communicating any updates to the API evaluators. So in other words, those that are in this webinar and the webinar that we'll hold tomorrow, as well as anybody else that has expressed interest. So we'll provide you any updates as necessary based on the feedback or anything else that comes up during this evaluation period. So with that, I believe that concludes the formal part of the webinar, and if we want to open things up for questions, we can do that now.
Hello, and yes, there are several questions.
Okay.
The first one, can this be used as a replacement to dictionary tables as a downstream application? For example, TMS is a source now for MedDRA dictionary tables for downstream applications. Can this replace that? I can use API directly for the downstream applications instead of using TMS dictionary tables.
Well, I'm not completely sure I understand the TMS. I'm not familiar with that when you say the dictionary tables. So to try and answer the question, as I said earlier, the APIs provide all the features and functions of our web-based browser and the MedDRA version analysis tool. So if the functions that what you've just referred to perform similar functions, then you can use the APIs for that. I don't know if that answers your question or not. I'm just not familiar with what you referenced.
The next question. MedDRA version in this input file is for input terms?
Okay, which input, do we know which input file that's being referred to?
There's no mention of it. Perhaps that person can get back to us and provide some more information.
Well, I'll just make a general comment again. The input examples are JSON formatted request models for the various APIs, and you can use those with Swagger or with any other, if you go so far as to make API calls outside of Swagger through another application and authenticate, then you can use those as examples to evaluate the APIs.
There's a follow-up comment. I can talk on this query. I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not clear on that. If that individual wants to send a message to our help desk with additional information, we'd be more than happy to try and follow up with that.
Okay, the next question. What is the estimated time by when the APIs will be released?
October is our target date. So as I said, we're in our evaluation period. We want to get feedback from users. One of the things that I'm curious about is to make sure that we have sufficient documentation. I think we've done that, but I think there's probably room for improvement, particularly in the programmer's guide. We've done put a lot of work into making sure that we have all the information in there, but there may be areas that could be improved to help with understanding.
And as a follow-up to the original question from Manish, what should the MedDRA version in input files?
Okay, well, I'm not clear I understand the question. So just in general, the application program interfaces require a JSON formatted request, and there are examples of those that I've shown in this webinar, and you can use those as a starting point to understand how to use the APIs and request information.
The next question. In the FAQ, the throttling of incoming requests is mentioned. How will this be realized? In addition, could you give some details about the request limitations for the MedDRA API? Will it be possible to perform several requests per second or minute?
Good question. So as I mentioned, we don't have any details at this time about the throttling, but I would expect that you would be able to make multiple requests at a reasonable frequency. Now, what is reasonable? That has yet to be determined, but we clearly want to make it viable for users to use. At the same time, we want to make sure that one organization isn't monopolizing the APIs and causing problems for others. But again, that all has to be determined because people are not yet using the APIs, so it's hard for us to give any details at this time.
The next question. Would the expected performance, resilience, uptime allow for direct integration between applications offering user searching to large numbers of users? Would request throttling be applied?
Well, throttling would likely be applied just to make sure, as I said, for fair and even access. But our intent in developing the APIs and the architectures around the APIs is to be able to support things like that.
The next question. Will all download formats still be available?
Oh, yes. We are not going to modify or substitute the ability to download the MedDRA data files, and users can, those will certainly be produced and they'll be available. There's no plans to end that at all. In fact, we need those files anyway for our for the APIs. That's the data. So we'll continue to produce that.
The next question. Can we use this API to replace the Argus ARIS-G safety software that have inbuilt browsers for MedDRA coding in adverse events, medical history, etc.?
Well, again, I think that's an organizational decision. If you're asking, can the APIs provide browsing and searching, the answer is yes. Now, is that going to fit into what you want to do? That I can't say, but the APIs will have that capability.
What are the throttling limits being considered? If an application wanted to do 500,000 to 1 million term lookups, would that be allowed?
Well, again, we don't have that information at this time, other than saying that throttling will be in place, but we'll communicate what that is once we have more information.
TMS is Oracle's dictionary management system. The versioning files provided by the MSSO is loaded into a dictionary structure in TMS for use of the MedDRA dictionary for medical coding and other processes. That's a follow-up.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think my answer is similar to the previous question. It's going to be up to your organization to determine how you use the APIs and how you integrate those into your existing tool sets. You'll have to make that determination on an organization by organization basis.
The next question. Will you provide code examples for using the API outside of Swagger, for example, in a JavaScript or Python application?
Good question. Let me call on Glenn for that. I'm not sure if I can answer that question.
Currently, there are no examples. We haven't produced anything. I mean, we have used the APIs in our mobile browser, but not examples hasn't been approved yet.
Okay, so maybe that's something we could provide is one or two examples of that.
That's possible.
Okay, thank you for that.
The next question. You mentioned that production application will be hosted in the cloud at various locations. Will developers be able to select the location to which they execute their API calls?
The way that it will work is that there will be a load balancer. Yeah, there'll be a load balancer that will direct you to the nearest location. So that shouldn't be necessary.
Next question. Is there any limitation for the number of data input, like there is a restriction now with web-based browser with 100,000 data limit for input?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So the answer to that is, at least for now, the APIs mimic that limit. So in other words, you'd only be able to upload 100,000 records for a SMQ analysis or a hierarchy analysis or a data impact report call. But again, we'll monitor that to see what users need and adapt accordingly. So far, based on our analysis of the usage of the current tools, 100,000 records is more than sufficient. But again, if that proves to be incorrect, then we will see what we can do to take steps to adjust things so that they meet users' needs.
The next question. Will your documentation provide examples of automated calls using scripting languages such as Python, or will there be a wiki where such examples can be found?
Okay, I think we sort of answered that question. I think we'll provide some examples in Java or another language just to help users with that.
Is there a standard character set for the responses, especially in non-English/Latin languages?
Okay, Glenn, can you answer that question?
Yeah, the character sets I don't think we changed them. Whatever you would normally get out of the database in a web-based browser and other tools that we have would be the same thing you'll get out of here.
Okay, so that would be UTF-8. Is that appropriate?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So for the character-based languages like Chinese and Korean, it would be a UTF-8 format.
What type of searches does the API support? Only direct hits against the dictionary term?
Well, the search logic mimics what is currently done in the web-based browser, the mobile browser, and the MedDRA desktop browser. So if you're familiar with that, that is the search capability of the API.
Is there an additional subscription cost for the API anticipated on top of the standard commercial license? If so, when will this cost be made public?
Okay, excellent question. And I should have mentioned this earlier. So again, just like all of the tools that the MSSO provides, there is no additional cost for these APIs beyond what you use for your pay for your subscription. And that's the same with all our tools. So there is no additional charge to use the web-based browser or MVAT, and the same would be true for the APIs.
Will there be further development of functions available in desktop MedDRA browser, and will there be a possibility to implement custom adjustments to this software?
So, what did it refer to, the desktop browser?
Yes.
We don't have, let me think about that. Not at this time. Our goal is to provide, keep the desktop browser in harmony with the web-based browser and the mobile browser so that everyone can experience the same environment with respect to searches and, to the extent possible, capabilities like the SMQ analysis function and hierarchy analysis, etc. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but hopefully it does.
For the search API, how much variation of text is allowed? For example, case insensitive, whitespace insensitive, accent mark insensitive, width insensitive, Japanese half / full width, etc.
Okay, so the search, as I mentioned earlier, works similarly to the search function in the web-based browser. So you mentioned, for example, diacritical marks. By default, diacritical marks are ignored. There is a feature, you can change that, and the API allows you to do that if you want to do that. But essentially, all the features that you see in the web-based browser with respect to the search logic, so you can do more advanced search with Boolean operators, and all of the various options that you have will work the same.
And there seem to be no more questions at this time.
Okay. Well, we'll hang out for a few more minutes to see if there's any additional questions.
Oh, one just popped up. Can we search term in different dictionary version at once?
Good question. The answer is no. You have to search in a single, a specific version of MedDRA.
No more questions are coming in at this point.
Okay. All right, well, we'll hang out for another 5 minutes to see if anyone has any additional questions. Now, as Liz mentioned, we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting this on the website. In what section is it? Is it the tools area?
Yes.
Where are we going to post that, Liz?
The training materials tools section.
Okay, training materials tools, perfect. And then I think we have another webinar tomorrow. It's on the same information, but we will be recording that webinar as well, and we'll have both webinars available because I'm sure we'll be getting different sets of questions in the Q&A period. So you're welcome to take a look at that as well after we conclude that webinar tomorrow evening.
And there are additional questions that have come in. Can we search term using term like PT, LLT?
You can, I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Just like in the web-based browser, the searches will pull up PTs and LLTs. You can limit your search to just the PT or LLT level. Again, those are parameters that you turn off and on in the API, just like you can do in the web-based browser.
So if term belongs to MedDRA 20.1, do we have a feature to find the corresponding term in 22.1?
Well, the term itself would be the same. It may be in a different location, but it's not going to have a different name unless there's a minor spelling or punctuation update or something like that. There is a history function.
Version report would be better for that to find out which PTs, LLTs, and other terms have changed and moved. I'd use the version report for that part. Yeah.
Yep. Good point, Glenn.
The history also would work as well, though.
Right. If it's just a single term, history might be better if you're looking for a whole set of terms, as Glenn mentioned. The version report, or again, the data impact report is the best way to go on that.
The next question, can you use the API to retrieve the entire structure and replace the files?
Good question. The short answer to that is no. That's not something that the APIs do. It's not meant to download the entire MedDRA unless you make lots and lots and lots of API calls. So practically, that's not feasible.
Will there be implemented a possibility to save searches to use them on different data sets in the browser?
Well, again, that's going to be based on what you do with your tool. So the API would provide the information in a search, and then in the tool that you develop, you could save that information for later if you wanted to, but that's not a specific API function.
The next question, will the slides be made available?
Yes, in fact, I think I have a version of these slides that are in the download materials that we provided, but we'll post this with the webinar information or the recorded webinar.
I mean to use saved search parameters on different data sets loaded to the browser. This is a follow-up to the question about implemented a possibility of saved searches.
Okay, well, I think my answer is going to be the same. You can use the API call for searches, and you can change the parameters on a per search basis. And then if you want in the application you develop, you can save that information. But the API call, the API is not going to save information.
Okay, and the next one, is this possible to get response other than JSON, like XML format or CSV file?
Well, I think JSON is Glenn, you can help me out here, is the standard modern way that APIs are format that APIs use.
Yeah, that's correct. But there's plenty of ways to convert to JSON into any format you really need. So I don't think we'll be providing that.
Okay. Yeah, there's tools on the web to make conversions to various file formats.
No more questions yet.
Okay. Well, again, we'll continue to hang out.
Just waiting on more questions.
Okay.
I don't see any more popping up.
Okay, we'll just give it another minute or so, and then we'll conclude. Again, I thank everybody for attending this presentation. We appreciate all the questions, and we're looking forward to the feedback that you can provide us to help us finalize the APIs when we do that for the autumn timeframe in October.
I also wanted to point out that I sent a link to the audience for that has access to the web page for the materials that were provided for this webinar.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Liz.
So if folks want to go over to their chat panel, they can pull that link. No more questions. Everybody just says thank you.
Okay. All right, well then, that being the case, again, if there are questions that you think of after this webinar concludes, you're more than welcome to submit them to our help desk. And we just ask you put in the subject API question to make it clear to our help desk staff that it has to do with the APIs, and we'll answer that as soon as we can.
Okay, everybody, thank you for attending. Brian, shall I close out now?
Yes, please.